Have you ever ended a long, exhausting day feeling completely drained? Yet when you look at your endless list of unfinished tasks, you convince yourself you accomplished absolutely nothing. We punish ourselves every single night for the empty spaces we failed to fill, completely forgetting the heavy stones we spent all day carrying. If you are being crushed by the weight of feeling like you are constantly falling behind, this story will finally set you free. Stay with me until the end. There is a quiet kind of exhaustion that does not come from the body, but from something much deeper, something harder to name, something that follows you even when you finally stop moving. It is the feeling of being in debt to your own life, as if the moment you wake up, you already owe the day more than you could ever repay. And then no matter how much you give, it never feels like enough. You move, you try, you push, and yet by the time the light fades, a voice inside you whispers that you are still behind, still lacking, still not quite who you were supposed to be. This is the mountain you have been climbing, though no one ever pointed it out to you clearly and no one warned you how it grows. It is not made of stone or earth, but of expectations stacked endlessly upon expectations, of plans that multiply faster than they can be fulfilled, of invisible standards that rise each time you reach for them. And the cruelest part is this: the higher you climb, the further away the peak seems to move, as if the summit itself refuses to let you arrive. You wake up not at the base of a new journey, but halfway up a slope you never chose, already carrying the weight of yesterday's unfinished thoughts, already measuring yourself against what has not yet been done. And so, without realizing it, your life begins to feel less like a path you walk and more like a debt you must constantly repay, a debt that compounds with every passing hour. It is subtle at first, almost invisible, but over time it reshapes the way you see everything. Because when your day is framed as a list of what must be done, every unchecked task becomes a quiet accusation, every delay becomes evidence, and every moment of rest feels undeserved. You begin to believe that your worth is tied not to what you have carried, but to what you have not yet completed. And so no matter how much effort you pour into the day, it dissolves the moment you notice what remains undone. That is how the mountain grows. And somewhere along the way, you forget something simple, something almost too obvious to notice. You did move forward, you did carry weight, you did build something, even if it was not everything. But the mind does not count what is finished when it is trained to search for what is missing, and so your progress becomes invisible to you, hidden behind the shadow of what still lies ahead. This is where the quiet frustration turns into something heavier. Because it is not just tiredness anymore. It is a slow erosion of belief, a subtle conviction that no matter how hard you try, you are always just short of enough. And once that idea takes root, it begins to shape your posture, your thoughts, your sense of identity, until even your victories feel temporary and your efforts feel insignificant. You are climbing, but it feels like sinking. And maybe, without saying it out loud, there is already something today that you are holding against yourself. Something small or something heavy. Something you did not finish. Something you promised you would do, but did not. It lingers in the back of your mind, quietly replaying, quietly judging, quietly turning everything else you did into something that feels smaller than it really was. You feel it now. So let me ask you, not gently but honestly, what is the one thing you are punishing yourself for not finishing today? Hold that thought because it matters more than you think and not in the way you have been taught to believe. Because that single unfinished thing is not just a task, it is a symbol, a piece of the mountain you have been taught to measure yourself against. Atetero, a marker of a system that quietly convinces you that you are always behind. And as long as you keep measuring your days this way, the mountain will never shrink. But what if the problem is not your effort, not your discipline, not your ability to follow through, but the very way you are measuring your life in the first place? What if the mountain itself is an illusion, built not from reality, but from the habit of only seeing what is missing? Because if that were true, then everything you feel right now, the pressure, the guilt, the quiet disappointment, would not be proof that you are failing, but evidence that you have been counting the wrong things all along. And if that is true, then there is a way out. But to see it, we have to step into a different story, one that begins not with you, but with someone who lived his entire life under the same invisible weight. Someone who believed, just like you, that no matter how much he did, it was never enough. And his name was Elias. In a kingdom where stone rose into the sky and monuments seemed to defy time itself, there lived a young stonemason named Elias, whose hands were calloused long before his years should have required it. Each morning before the first light stretched across the land, he would unroll a vast sheet of parchment across his wooden table, its surface already crowded with lines, measurements, and endless additions that seemed to grow more complex with each passing day. He did not begin his mornings with the sun, but with a burden, because before he ever touched a single stone, he had already decided how much he must achieve to prove that he was worthy of the life he had been given. The blueprint was not just a plan, it was a contract, a silent agreement that by nightfall he would become enough. And as his charcoal traced more lines across the parchment, his chest would tighten, not with doubt, but with a quiet urgency that never seemed to leave him. Then the day would begin, and Elias would move like a man possessed, lifting, placing, shaping, adjusting, again and again. His body bending under the weight of stone, while his mind remained fixed on something far ahead of him. The rhythm of his work was relentless, his focus unwavering, his effort undeniable, and yet there was something strange about the way he moved through it all. As if each stone he placed did not count unless it brought him closer to a distant image he could never quite reach. Because in his mind, the castle was already finished, towering, flawless, complete, and every moment he spent building it was measured not by what he had done, but by how far he still was from that perfect vision. And so, no matter how many stones he set into the earth, they disappeared in his awareness the moment they were placed, swallowed by the overwhelming presence of what remained undone. As the sun climbed higher and the heat pressed down on his shoulders, Elias did not slow, did not pause, did not allow himself the small satisfaction of progress, because satisfaction, to him, was something reserved for the end, and the end was always too far away. There was always more to build, more to fix, more to complete, and so the day stretched longer, heavier, and quieter, filled not with pride, but with a constant sense of chasing something that refused to be caught. And when the evening finally came, when the tools were set aside and the air cooled just enough for breath to deepen, Elias would return to his small quarters. His body aching, his hands trembling slightly from the strain. He would sit before the parchment once again, now lit by a dim flicker of firelight, and his eyes would scan the blueprint not for what had been accomplished, but for what remained. And that is where everything would collapse. Because the same parchment that had driven him forward in the morning now became a mirror of failure at night, reflecting back not the hundreds of stones he had laid, but the vast emptiness of what was still untouched. His breath would shorten, his chest would tighten, and a quiet voice would begin to speak. Not loudly, not harshly, but with a calm certainty that was impossible to ignore. You did not do enough. And the cruelest part was that Elias believed it, completely, deeply, without question, because from his perspective, it was true. The castle was not finished, the blueprint was still incomplete, and therefore, no matter how much he had given, it could never outweigh what was still left to do. His effort was real, but his measurement erased it. Night after night, this cycle repeated itself, until the exhaustion he felt was no longer just physical, but something deeper, something heavier, something that began to shape the way he saw himself. He was no longer just a builder, he was a man perpetually behind, a man defined not by his work, but by his inability to finish it. But here is what no one in the kingdom realized, not even Elias himself. There was no one who worked harder than him. No one who carried more stone, who stayed longer under the sun, who pushed further past the limits of their own strength, and yet somehow he was also the one who felt the most inadequate. The one who believed more than anyone else that he was falling short. Because effort does not create confidence when it is invisible to the one who gives it, and Elias had become blind to his own labor. unable to see the weight he lifted, the progress he made, the structure that was slowly rising beneath his hands. All he could see was the distance, and when a man can only see the distance, no amount of movement will ever feel like progress. This is the trap, the quiet distortion that turns the hardest worker into the harshest critic, that transforms dedication into despair, that makes even the strongest effort feel like failure. It is not the lack of action that breaks a person, but the inability to recognize it. And if you are honest, you have felt this too, in your own way, in your own life, in those moments where you give everything you have. And still end the day with the quiet, heavy belief that it was not enough. Because like Elias, you have been staring at the blueprint. But what happens when someone takes it away? It happened on an evening that felt no different from the ones before, and perhaps that is why it changed everything. Elias sat hunched over his parchment, the fire beside him whispering softly as shadows flickered across the walls, and his eyes moved slowly across the blueprint. Tracing the same unfinished sections that had haunted him night after night. His body was heavy, his breath shallow, and somewhere deep inside a familiar thought began to rise again, steady and certain, as if it had been waiting patiently for this exact moment. You are still not there. He did not resist it anymore, because resisting had never helped, and so he simply sat with it, letting it settle into his chest like a weight he had grown used to carrying. And yet on this particular night, there was something else in the room, something quiet but present, something he had not noticed when he first entered. An old man stood near the hearth, his posture relaxed, his eyes steady, watching not the fire, but Elias. The young builder did not speak at first, because there was nothing to say that had not already been said inside his own mind 100 times before. But the silence between them did not feel empty. It felt observed, as if for the first time, someone was not looking at the castle he had yet to build, but at the man who had been trying to build it. "You look at that parchment," the old man finally said, his voice calm, almost gentle, "as if it holds the truth about you." Elias exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening slightly around the edges of the blueprint, and for a moment he considered dismissing the words. Brushing them aside, like he had done with so many thoughts that threatened to interrupt his routine. But something in the man's presence made that difficult, as if ignoring him would require more effort than listening. "It shows me what remains," Elias replied, his voice low, measured, but tired in a way he could no longer hide. The old man nodded, stepping closer, his gaze shifting briefly to the parchment before returning to Elias himself, as if the drawing held little interest compared to the person studying it. "And what you have already done. Where is that written?" The question lingered, not because it was complex, but because Elias had no answer for it, and the absence of that answer felt strangely uncomfortable, like a gap he had never noticed before. He glanced back at the blueprint, as if searching for proof that it accounted for everything, but all he saw were lines stretching forward, endless, demanding, incomplete. "It does not matter," Elias said after a moment, though the certainty in his voice had begun to thin. "What matters is what is left." The old man studied him for a long second, not with judgment, but with a kind of quiet understanding that felt almost unsettling, as if he had seen this pattern before, perhaps many times. "Then you have chosen," he said slowly, "to measure your life by what is missing." Before Elias could respond, before he could defend the logic that had guided him for so long, the old man reached forward, his hand steady, and took hold of the parchment. There was no hesitation, no warning, no explanation, and in one smooth, deliberate motion, he turned and cast it directly into the fire. For a brief second, Elias did not move, as if his mind had not yet caught up with what his eyes had just witnessed. But then, the realization struck. Sharp and immediate, and he lunged forward instinctively, his hand reaching toward the flames as the edges of the parchment curled and blackened. "What are you doing?" he shouted, the calm he had carried all day breaking apart in an instant, replaced by something raw, something urgent, something close to panic. But the old man did not react with alarm, did not rush to stop the fire, did not apologize or explain, and that stillness was almost more jarring than the act itself. "Watch," he said quietly. And so Elias did. The lines he had drawn so carefully, the measurements he had obsessed over, the endless list of what remained undone, all of it twisted and dissolved into ash. As consumed by the very fire that had warmed him moments before. It happened quickly, far more quickly than he expected, and within seconds there was nothing left but faint embers and a thin trail of smoke rising into the air. Elias stood frozen, his chest rising and falling, his thoughts scattered, searching for something to hold on to, something to rebuild from. But there was nothing. The blueprint was gone. And for the first time in as long as he could remember, there was no future to measure himself against. Only the present remained. "You think that parchment guided you," the old man said, his voice steady, almost soft against the crackling of the fire. "But it did not guide you. It judged you." Elias swallowed, his gaze still fixed on the place where the blueprint had been, and slowly, something unfamiliar began to surface beneath the shock, something quieter, something he could not yet fully understand. "If you spend your life staring at the peak of a mountain," the old man continued, stepping closer to the hearth, "you will always feel small. Because the peak does not move, no matter how far you climb." He paused, letting the words settle, letting Elias feel them rather than simply hear them. "But if you look down," he added, his tone shifting slightly, not stronger but clearer, "you will see the path beneath your feet, the distance you have already crossed. The ground that now belongs to you because you walked it." Elias closed his eyes for a moment, and for the first time, he tried to imagine it. Not the towering castle, not the endless future, but the stones he had already placed, the work his hands had already completed. It was difficult at first, almost unnatural, because his mind had been trained to ignore those things, to discard them the moment they were done. But as he stood there, something began to shift, subtle but undeniable, like the first crack in a structure that had once felt immovable. Because if the mountain could only make him feel small when he looked at the top, then maybe he had been looking in the wrong direction all along. And if that was true, then everything he believed about his own inadequacy might not be truth at all. It might just be perspective. The silence that followed the burning of the parchment did not feel like loss. It felt unfamiliar, almost weightless, as if something Elias had carried for so long had been removed so suddenly that his body had not yet learned how to stand without it. He remained near the fire, his thoughts searching for direction, for structure, for something to replace what had just been taken from him. But nothing came. For the first time in years, there was no list waiting for him, no unfinished lines demanding his attention, and strangely, that frightened him. Because without the blueprint, he did not know how to measure himself anymore, and without measurement, he did not know how to decide if he was enough. The old certainty that he was behind had at least been familiar, something he could rely on, something predictable. But now even that was gone, and in its place was something far more uncomfortable. Uncertainty. The old man seemed to sense it without needing to ask, and from within his cloak he pulled out a small leather-bound journal, its surface worn but intact, its pages untouched. He held it out, not as a gift, but as an invitation. And Elias hesitated before taking it, his fingers brushing against the cover as if unsure what it was meant to hold. "This," the old man said, "is your new rule." Elias looked down at the empty pages, then back at the man, confusion quietly rising beneath the surface. "You are no longer allowed to plan what you will build," he continued, his tone calm but firm. "You may only record what you have already placed into the earth." Elias frowned slightly, the habit of resistance returning, not loudly, but subtly, as if his mind was trying to protect the system it had depended on for so long. "That makes no sense," he replied. "How will I know what to do tomorrow?" The old man smiled, not dismissively, but knowingly, as if he had heard this question many times before. "You will know," he said, "because you have always known." The problem was never your ability to act. It was your inability to see. Elias said nothing, but the words settled into him, stirring something deeper than logic, something that felt less like instruction and more like truth he had been avoiding. "That parchment," the old man added, glancing briefly at the fading embers, "kept you in debt to a future that does not exist. This," he gestured gently toward the journal, "will show you what you have already earned." The distinction was subtle, but powerful. Debt and earning. For so long, Elias had lived as if every day was a balance he had to repay, as if his worth was determined by what remained undone. But now, for the first time, he was being asked to see his life differently, not as something he owed, but as something he was building piece by piece, stone by stone. And yet, even as the idea began to take shape, doubt lingered. Because what if the pages remained empty? What if, when faced with the truth of his own actions, there was nothing worth recording? That fear sat quietly in his chest as the night deepened, as the fire dimmed, as the world outside settled into stillness. And eventually, with a slow breath, Elias opened the journal for the first time. The blank page stared back at him, not accusing, not demanding, simply waiting. He hesitated. Then, almost reluctantly, he began to write. One stone, then another, then another. At first, the entries felt small, almost insignificant, each line carrying a quiet doubt, as if he were unsure whether these actions deserved to be remembered at all. But as his hand continued to move, something unexpected began to happen. The page started to fill. Not with grand achievements or completed castles, but with moments, efforts, pieces of the day that he had always dismissed as not enough. The stones he carried, the sections he reinforced, the adjustments he made, the hours he endured beneath the weight of his work, all of it began to take form in ink. And when he finally stopped, when his hand grew still and his breath deepened, Elias looked down at the page and felt something he had not felt in a very long time. Not relief, not pride, but recognition. Because for the first time he could see it. He had not been standing still. He had been building. And suddenly the mountain did not feel as heavy, not because it had changed, but because he was no longer measuring himself by the peak. He was measuring himself by the ground he had already claimed. And in that shift, something inside him began to loosen, as if the weight he carried was not just physical, but something he had placed upon himself, something he could now begin to set down. Because counting what you lack creates a debt you can never repay. But counting what you build creates something entirely different. Momentum. And momentum changes everything. The next morning did not arrive with pressure. It arrived with space. Elias stepped into the day not as a man already behind, not as someone trying to repay an invisible debt, but as someone beginning again with empty hands and a quieter mind. The work did not change. The stones were just as heavy, the sun just as relentless. But something within him had shifted in a way that was almost impossible to explain, yet undeniable in how it felt. Because for the first time, he was not chasing the castle. He was placing the next stone, and that changed everything. Throughout the day, his movements remained steady, deliberate, focused, but no longer rushed by the distant image of perfection that once consumed him. Each action stood on its own, each effort carried its own weight, and though the castle still stretched far beyond what he could complete in a single day, it no longer erased what he had already done. That night he returned to the journal, not with hesitation, but with curiosity, and again he wrote. Not one stone, not 10, but dozens. Things he would have once ignored, dismissed, forgotten, now stood clearly before him, undeniable, real, permanent. And as the days passed, something deeper began to form, not just in the castle rising from the earth, but in the way Elias carried himself within it. His posture changed. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but subtly, as if a quiet confidence had begun to root itself beneath the surface. The kind of confidence that does not come from finishing everything, but from knowing you are moving consistently, meaningfully forward. And over time, something remarkable happened. The castle was completed. Not in a moment of triumph, not in a burst of effort, but in the quiet accumulation of days that no longer felt like failure. Stone by stone, page by page, effort by effort, it rose. Not because Elias became stronger, but because he was no longer weakened by the belief that he was always behind. He did not build faster. He stopped doubting slower, and that was enough. My friend, this story is about you. Because your mind, just like Elias's, is wired to search for the gap between where you are and where you think you should be. And if you do not interrupt that pattern, it will quietly drain your confidence no matter how much you achieve. You will keep building, keep moving, keep trying, and still feel like you are standing still. So here is what must change. You must stop measuring your life by what remains undone, and start recognizing what has already been built. Burn the endless list of daily debts, not literally but mentally, because as long as your days begin with obligation, they will end with inadequacy. Then, each evening, take a few minutes not to judge your day, but to record it, to capture the stones you carried, the effort you gave, the things that moved forward because you showed up. Even if they feel small, especially if they feel small. And finally, each morning, begin from zero. Not from what you did not finish yesterday, but from the simple truth that you are here again, able to build again. Able to place the next stone without the weight of everything that came before pressing down on you. Because confidence is not built from perfection. It is built from evidence, and your life is full of it. If this story meant something to you, take a moment and write down what your invisible stones were today, the things you did that you almost ignored. This is where change begins. And if you know someone who feels like they are constantly falling behind, share this with them, because they might just need to see what they have already built. I'll see you in the next story.